I titled my program, or my little part, Finding Connections. Researching Dillon history is most rewarding when you make a connection between families and find proof that brings them together. Stories from the past just start to make sense. In the 25 years that I've been doing hair, I find myself asking new folks to town, what brought you to Dillon? A lot of times it's a job that's landed them here. Sometimes it's due to the great fishing that our waters have to offer. But most of the time, it's simply because they have family here in Beaverhead County. Here are a few early day pioneers of Dillon, why they came to town, and how they are all connected. Simeon Estes. Simeon Estes first came to Montana in August of 1863. He drove the flag wagon for the second expedition over the northern route. It was led by Captain James Fisk. When they arrived in Bannock, Fisk disbanded his party and Estes decided to stay. He opened a feed stable and joined forces with the vigilantes of Bannock. On January 10, 1864, it is said that Sim slipped the noose around Plummer's neck that cold winter day. In 1865, Governor Edgerton needed protection to get his family to Fort Benton. Sim transported them safely, even amongst the Shoshone attack just miles from the fort. The wagon was used as a barricade, and the Shoshone eventually rode off. Later, in the year of 1865, Simeon settled on Red Rock River. He farmed many acres and raised several head of livestock. But there was only one thing missing. In 1866, Sim arranged to meet Miss Rebecca Jackson in Council Bluffs, Iowa. The two were supposedly married there and traveled back to Montana together on a wagon road. Rebecca left behind 4 children and a husband in Wisconsin. In the 1860 census, they were living together in Sparta, Wisconsin. I wonder why she left them behind. Perhaps she knew Sim because they only lived 20 miles from each other in their homeland of Maine. Or would it have been the beauty of Montana that Sim would write about to his friends back home? Mr. and Mr. Estes lived on the ranch on the Red Rock River until 1868. Sim sold the ranch to Joseph Scheinberger. The ranch later became the town of Red Rock and then the Rowe Ranch. Simeon then became a member of the Montana Territorial House of Representatives in 1868 through 69. His special concerns while serving in that office was on roads. Sim was most instrumental on the road from Silver Star in Madison County to the summit of the Rocky Mountains on Medicine Lodge Creek, possibly Bannock Pass. In the 1870 census, Sim was listed at living at Ryan's Station, working as a freighter. Under Sim was listed Emily. I believe this was Rebecca, even though there was 6 years cut off her age. Was she hiding? There was also a boy, James, that was listed under there, 17. Could it be William? William was Rebecca's oldest son. When he was 7, he was living with them in Wisconsin. The dates match, although Rebecca's first husband, Mr. Jackson, has William listed under him in the census. In 1871, Sim purchased Ryan Station from Philip Lovell. Sim then changed the name to Watson Station. He was the postmaster. He also ran a hotel and a general store. The stage stop, sitting right at the mouth of Ryan's Canyon, now Barrett's, was a good stop for travelers on the old stage line from Salt Lake to Fort Benton. That road was known as the Great Beaverhead Wagon Road. Sim housed many travelers, including Chief Tendoy of the Lamhi tribe. In December of 1876, the nearest newspaper in Virginia City, called the Madisonian, published a column of marriages. Sim, being the Justice of Peace at Watson Station for the Beaverhead Valley, signed the marriage certificate and officiated the wedding for a Mr. Ed Marlowe to a Miss Abby Jackson. Well, Abby just happens to be Rebecca's youngest child. So somewhere in between 1870 and 1876, Abby left Iowa, where she was living with her father and siblings, and came to Montana, where her mother was. Sim knew the railroad was coming from Corinne, Utah to the mining fields of Montana on to Butte City, and he was ready to embrace the opportunity the rails would bring to the Beaverhead Valley. The railroad hit Ryan's Canyon in March of 1880, and terminus was determined to be set up. It was thought first to be set up at the mouth of Ryan's Canyon near the stage stop until a homesteader by the name of Richard Deacon would not allow the right-of-way for the railroad through his ranch, stalling the progression of the railroad until a plan was in place. 1 month later, Rebecca Estes dies from the effects of morphine. Whether it was true from the telegram sent from Sim Estes to the Madisonian that she committed suicide, or a week later of the Helena paper corrected the death by stating that Mrs. Estes had been struck in the stomach by a belligerent drunk that was traveling by. The pain was so that she took morphine, began to get sicker, and died right there at Watson Station. Her death simply reads morphine for cause. Ed and Abby Marlowe stayed in Beaverhead County after Rebecca's death. Ed ran Sim's Lively stable on Helena Street, becoming a successor to Sim and later owning that stable. Ed passed away in Montana in 1901, and Abby a year later in Nebraska, where she had gone to spend her last days with her brother Nelson and her father Deering Jackson. At that point, they were all she had. Oh, but by 1910, Deering and Jackson Nelson are now listed in St. Anthony, Idaho. So if Rebecca was hiding, I believe she was found and not forgotten, as her grave states. Rebecca E., wife of Simeon Estes, died April 22nd, 1880, aged 45, not forgotten. Her son Nelson shows back up in Dillon in 1910 and married his second wife, Cora. Could this have been a tribute to his mother, or just a really good hiding place for a marriage? Rebecca's first husband, Deering, passed away in 1913, and Nelson in 1932. Both died and are buried in St. Anthony, Idaho. 5 months after Rebecca's death in September of 1880, the Terminus businessmen met at Sim's stage station. B.F. White, J.E. Morris, Edward Ferns, Charles Lefevre, Howard Seabury, J.M. Barrett, and others, with the lead of Simeon Estes, traveled 8 miles north to Deacon's Ranch to purchase the land to secure the right for the railroad. Hence, the location of Terminus was now determined where the land was purchased, where the Beaverhead River and the Blacktail Creek meet. Dillon postmark remained Terminus until April of 1881, when Terminus was moved to Melrose. May 31st, 1881, Dillon got its own post office, putting Watson Station post office out of business. The Dingleys. Uncle Sim influenced many family members from Maine, his birthplace, to come to Beaverhead County. His sister, Marianne Estes, and her husband, John Tabor Dingley, moved here first in 1877. The two brought with them their 3 children to Montana. Mamie, John's youngest daughter, wrote in her journal, "Through the year of 1873, my father had developed a stomach trouble unknown to medical science at the time. So he took his family of 3 children, 2 boys and myself, I was 3 then, back to the old home of Maine. His poor health made it hard to support his family, and because of the urging of my Uncle Sim, who was doing well in Montana and needed help at his stage station out in Montanatory, he came west in early 75. After he moved his family into an apartment in Boston where he lived for a year and a half until we started to Montana in late of 76. There was no train at the time west of Boston, so we went by train through Canada, southwest to Salt Lake, the end of the railroad. From there, we traveled by stage station drawn by 4 pairs of horses. 3 or 4 days through deep snow and blizzards and bitter cold weather. We reached Watson Station, the name of my uncle's stage station store and post office, late that night, January 10th, 1877. I was 7 years old that day. In their time at Watson Station, there was a story passed down a couple of generations. The story was told by Mamie's granddaughter, Marie, dated 1979. I remember Grandma telling me about the Indians when we first came to Montana. Grandma Dingley had false teeth. One day, all the men had gone hunting or to town or somewhere away from home, and she was alone with Mamie, our grandmother, and her and her little sister Alice. An Indian came through the door while she was cleaning her teeth. She was afraid anyway and hated to be left alone. When she put her teeth back in her mouth, the Indian left. In a few moments, he came back with a lot of warriors. They all tried to take their teeth out. So she had to take hers in and out a number of times just to show them. And she was very relieved when the men returned. John Tabor was the postmaster at Watson Station for 8 months in 1877. He then moved his family to Butte City, where he worked as a teamster. He returned to Beaverhead County in 1881 when Dillon was formed. He ran the Dillon Hotel, and Mary Ann Estes Dingley ran a millinery and dressmaking shop. Their home was on the corner of Glendale and Montana Streets. The Dingley building in the Dingley block was built in 1889, possibly with some financial help from someone. John Tabor's declining health made it hard for him to keep a job and make good money. They were behind on taxes and their home was at risk. In 1892, John returned to Maine for medical treatment and he passed away there in November. He is buried beside his 4 children that had died in infancy. Mary Ann closed her dress and hat making shop and lived with her children. William, Billy Dingley, settled in Butte City originally. He was a jockey rider. He helped train Spokane, the horse from the round barn of Noah Armstrong's that won the 1889 Kentucky Derby. Later in life, he moved just south of Dillon. Mary Ann lived at his ranch at her time of death, and her death was rather tragic. She had been at her son's house 20 miles south of Dillon at Clark's Canyon. As she was fixing a garment, she put a pin in her mouth. Shortly after, she forgot and swallowed that pin. A doctor was called out to the ranch, but was unsuccessful with retrieving it. She died 5 days later of blood poisoning at her daughter's house in Butte after another attempt by Butte physicians failed to retrieve the sharp object. John and Mary Ann's son, David, followed them to Montana, eventually being a co-founder in the First Baptist Church here in Dillon. He was an attorney of law and helped Uncle Sim for years with legal documents, as Sim was the justice of peace. M.J. McCune and Mamie Dingley McCune. Mamie is the youngest daughter of John Tabor and Mary Ann Estes Dingley. When she was but a girl, family stories passed down or said that her future husband rode by the Dingley house and said to his friend, "I'm going to marry that girl someday." And his companion said, "Well, you're going to have to wait a while." For Mamie was 12, 19 years younger than Michael McCune. By 1885, McCune had a business in Dillon, a brickyard, advertised as No Straw Bricks. That same year, he was contracted for the mason work on the First Baptist Church. In 1886, MJ got the contract for the new brewery, which sat on the corner where Barrett's Clinic sits today. July 10th of 1886, Michael McCune married Miss Mamie Dingley, and the Dillon Examiner read. I'm not going to read it, but I just wanted to show it. The next year, in 1887, McCune advertises for the Dillon Steam Press Brickyard. He was a mason on the new jailhouse at the courthouse, the Opera House on the corner where CarQuest sits today. The Kuffner Corner was also contracted out by McCune for the masonry work. That building total cost was $16,500. MJ built several houses on the south side of town, including the addition to the Bishop House on Idaho Street. His brickyard was flourishing by 1891. He was contracted for the Emmerich Building and a 2.5-story brick house on Atlantic Street. He also built his family home on the corner of Washington and Orr Streets. That house no longer stands. In the 1990s, it was torn down and a new house sits on that lot today. Butte builders came to Dillon buying out all of McCurne's bricks from his yard. He was unsure whether to relocate, but Butte was the decision he made and he moved his family up there. MJ built a beautiful house at 516 South Montana Street in Butte. The lot is across from the town pump on the corner of Montana and Platinum Streets. The house no longer stands. McCune ended up being very successful in Butte. He built the reduction work stack, most of the Clark's block and Pennsylvania block. He was contracted for Will Clark's house and barn. He also did the mason work for the Broadway Theater. His last job was in Butte, completing the Butte Wholesale Warehouse. On December of 1905, McCune had run into some financial troubles, and he was also suffering from headaches. At 10:55 in the morning, he went upstairs to his den and shot himself in the heart, dying instantaneously, leaving behind his young wife, Mamie, and 3 children, Alice, Joe, and Lily. Mamie moved her family and 3 children to Mount Ellis Academy, a 7-day Adventist compound outside of Bozeman. In 1910, Mamie married Mr. Couch and moved to Stevensville. After his passing, she moved back to Bozeman to live next door to her daughter, Alice. She passed away in Portland in 1955, where she was then living with her daughter, Lily. Mamie's daughter, Alice, was married and had 3 children. Alice was a devoted mother and wife and raised her children next to the campus that later became Montana State University. A family history passed down from her daughter Lois states in 1927. Alice founded the Girl Scouts in Bozeman. She had become aware that there was no organization where girls could enjoy supervised plays like the boys, and she wanted them to have the same advantages as the Boy Scouts. She secured the sponsorship of the Bozeman Housekeepers Club, and the Girl Scouts were organized in March with Alice as the chair. Alice's health was poor most of her life. She almost drowned in Lake Yellowstone in 1906 at the age of 16. The boat her and 5 others were on capsized, and Alice hung on until help came. Unfortunately, 2 men died in the mishap. She ended up with circulation problems from the icy cold lake. But she lived till 1964, where she died at her daughter's house. She is buried in Bozeman. Speaking of finding connections, I was titling this program for Dillon History Days. I decided on finding connections due to one man, Sim Estes, and how he brought influential people to our new Montana town. About 3 weeks into my research, Candy Whitworth, our director, got a phone call to the museum from a gentleman in Wisconsin. He was looking into his family history. Candy gave me his contact information, being I was researching the same names that he was curious about. He had his family history very well written, but needed to know a few details that a local could only help with. My new friend, Mr. Mel Pope, just happens to be Sim Estes' great-great-nephew. John Tabor and Mary Ann Dingling's great-great-grandson? M.J. McCurn and Mary Dingley McCurn's great-grandchild and Alice's Mel's grandmother? I was able to help Mel sort out some of the gray areas for his family history project, and he was able to help me with this program. The family journal from the 1870s that Mamie wrote, the story of Mary Ann's dentures, along with a very well-written family history, along with beautiful pictures of the Dingley and McCune families. Mel inspired me to research more and to dig deeper into the history and the facts of this project. Without him, I wouldn't have this much information. Mel and I found a connection. It is with history. 2 buffs trying to find all the answers, studying the same family at the same time. I'm so lucky to have found Mel. You can tell his love for history brings him joy as it does for me. Here is a picture of baby Mel and his great-grandmother Mamie. The next picture is a 4th-generation picture of baby Mel, his beautiful mother Vivian, his grandmother Alice, and his great-grandmother Mamie. Frederick and Royal Dingley. Fred Dingley stayed at Uncle Sim's at Watson Station along with his little brother Royal. 2 Dingley brothers married 2 Estes' sisters, for they were lifelong friends back in their homeland of Maine. Fred homesteaded a small piece of land and piped warm water from the springs just south of Sim's stage stop. Later, he traded his property to invest in Lovell's livestock and lost everything. He died in the poor farm in 1950. Royal got married at his Uncle Sim's, Sim, once again serving the Justice of Peace. They lived with his wife's family on the Grasshopper Creek near the confluence of the Beaverhead River. He had several children with Harriet. moving around to various places before settling down at the old Prophet place where the Super 8 sits now. This was after Harriet's death in 1925, Roy passing in 1942. Both of them buried at Mountain View Cemetery. There are still a few descendants left in Dillon of the Royal Dingley bloodline. Lillian Hanson Culver. Lillian Hackett Hanson, later Culver, came in 1881 to Dillon on the first passenger train. Lillian brought with her a 4-year-old son. She cooked and cleaned at Sim Estes' stage station when she first arrived. Lillian's father married Sim Estes' sister, Jeanette Estes. Lillian soon after opened the first millinery shop in Dillon. Attached was a lodging house. That burnt to the ground in the infamous fire of downtown Dillon that took all of the wooden buildings out that were later replaced by the brick buildings in the mid to late 1880s. She later contracted rheumatic fever and lost the use of her fingertips, forcing her to leave behind her fine service of dress and hat making. She moved to the Centennial Valley with her son, Fred. Her brother, Henry Hackett, lived and worked out there where he managed a ranch at Elk Springs. Lillian picked out a perfect spot for her homestead. She later met Bill Culver at a dance at Henry's Lake. The two were married and they built that homestead together where her vision was. Her son and husband, Bill, never got along. They ended up damming the water across the 2 springs, which came from 2 warm springs that flowed out the side of the mountain. The pond was a mile long and stocked with rainbow and brook trout. Many eastern fishermen came to the narrow pond to fish. Some of the fish considered to be as long as 17 inches long. The pond was called Granny's Pond. Lillian helped an explorer by the name of Honorable J.B. Brower to find the source of the Missouri River. Later, he wrote a book, The Missouri River and Its Source. Mr. Brower set out for his expedition of the utmost headwaters of the Missouri in Centennial Valley in July of 1895. He was in awe of the picturesque sight of the valley and its winding river with ancient glacial depressions. After the hospitality of Mr. and Mrs. Culver, he set out for his adventure. They trailed up Hanson Mountain of Culver Canyon towards Lillian Lake. In 1895, Lillian wrote, "We decided to see just where the creek headed. So we kept going about 3 miles to the top of the divide. Suddenly, the creek turned quite abruptly and headed northeast to a quite pretty springs, which came from under a large black rock on the side of the mountain next to some basalt. It was a lonesome, wild place, and a dozen or more tiny springs higher up ran into this one. Marking the spot with my name and the date on a tin plate, and depositing a shoe that my horse had cast upon the largest rock. The rock was marked L.C. September 1895. Truly, I have been to the head of the Missouri. The springs is still known as Brewer Springs." Lillian Culver also was a correspondent for the Dillon Tribune, the Madison, and other papers from the 1890s through the 1930s. Some of her more interesting stories were August 21st, 1895, Dillon Tribune. "It is wicked the way that the young swan are being caught out on the Red Rock Lakes. A man from Lima has made 3 trips, and we are told by good authority that he got 20 to 30 young ones to sell. They even come from Henry's Lake to get them for sale. We ought to be putting a stop to this, or we will soon have none of our sacred birds on the lake." March 9th, 1897, Dillon Tribune. "It looks like some of the women in this valley will soon be entitled to divorces, if their husbands don't spend a little more time with them at home. It is a rather lonesome place to expect their wives to be content living alone so much." Lillian divorced her husband Bill later that year. March 21st, 1899, Dillon Tribune. "We hear it's rumored that a saloon is going to be started in the valley in the spring. But we hope this is not true, and in saying we, I mean a large majority of the citizens. If it weren't for whiskey and the evils caused by it, there wouldn't be half the misery there is in this world." November 2nd, 1899, Dillon Tribune. "There were 17 citizens that did not think enough for their right to vote to take the trouble to register. If that's all men care about is public affairs, then they better step out and let the women step in. September 6, 1900, the Madisonian. Mrs. L.E. Culver and son Fred Hansen have received 5,000 steelhead trout from the United States Fish Hatchery to put into their private pond at Picnic Springs. Lillian and Fred had their very own hatchery on their property. Granny Culver, as she was called, passed away in 1936 at her homestead on Picnic Springs. Around the time of her death, the U.S. government took over the land for a place to feed the wild trumpeter swans. A lot of land was bought up around the Red Rock Lakes, hunting lodges and homesteads torn down. Lillian Hansen Culver Homestead is now part of the east side of the Red Rock Lakes National Wildlife Refuge. Lillian Lake, southeast of the upper Red Rock Lake, is named after Granny Culver. It was Lillian and other Centennial Valley homesteaders that started that refuge. Lillian and Fred stocked the ponds with fish, and they knew exactly what they were doing when they dammed up those springs. Granny's pond also attracted the almost extinct trumpeter swan. The government gets the credit that Granny Culver and other influential pioneers of the Centennial Valley deserve. This photo was shared to me from Mel Pope. It's a group photo the year 1895 to 96. Mary Ann Estes Dingley is the large woman in the left rear with a bare head. Mamie Dingley McCurran is in the middle with her two children, Alice and Lily. And just left of Mary Ann Dingley is Lillian Hackett Hansen. Now it's going to get a little different. Harriet Oliver and Etta Thompson. When the railroad reached the town site of Dillon, a widowed woman and her two children, whom had been traveling the railroad from Utah, setting up a restaurant at every terminus, feeding most of the workers, settled in our new township. By March 31st, 1881, the widowed woman married her fourth husband, Sim Estes. Harriet Olive Wortham Estes owned the first restaurant in town called the Railroad Boarding House. She and her two children moved to Sim's Ranch south of Dillon. The newlyweds grew beautiful apple orchards, some trees still standing today. The fields at the Estes Ranch were lush sections of hay, wheat, and oats. Cattle and horses were raised on that 1,000-acre ranch. There were many parties or get-togethers of family and friends, and people talked about dancing the night away at the Estes and having picnics at the Grove. Remember, Sim was the Justice of Peace for Beaverhead County, and he continued that role when Dillon became Dillon. He owned a holding cell in the back of his saloon. Today, that wouldn't fly, but it was the 1880s. His lively stable sat on the corner of Washington and Helena Streets. He also built an in-town house on the corner of Washington and Reeder. Harriet's daughter, Mary Edna, was married in 1882 to a Mr. Eckersley. Once again, Sim signing the marriage certificate. Their first daughter, Harriet, was born in 1884, and their second, Lolita, in 1885. The marriage failed after 5 years, and she was divorced. Then, in 1894, Mary Edna married Joseph Thompson, changing her name to Etta Thompson. In the 1900 census, Joseph and Etta are living together on North Idaho Street. Etta, having two daughters, I was shocked to see that the two of them weren't living with them. Lulu, who was now 14, was living at Barrett Station with her grandparents, Sim and Hattie Estes. Just 2 years later, at the age of 16, Lulu marries a Mr. Oscar Creasy. Oscar, living in Red Bluffs over by Norris in Madison County in the 1900 census, listed as a border occupation minor. The year after they were married, they had a son, Simeon, and another boy, William, a year later, who died a month after his birth. Around the same time of baby William's death in October of 1904, Mrs. Harriet Estes passed away from stomach cancer at her daughter's home on North Pacific Street. She is buried just a couple lots away from Sim's first wife, Rebecca. Harriet's daughter, Etta Thompson, was suffering from her mother's death as well as her grandson's. She was living on the north end of town, and back then it was known to be the rough side. I'm imagining that her mother left her with some money. By 1907, she bought Vivian Moore's lodging house. 130 North Montana Street would be where the China Garden sits today. Back then, the lower level was the post office. By 1950, this lodging house would be known as the Montana Hotel, a brothel that closed in 1963. In 1908, Etta purchased another lodging house above where Woolmax sits today. In the 1950s, it was called the Mint Rooms, also closing in 63. In April of 1908, Simeon Estes sold his ranch to Jacob Spitzer. They were both pleased with the financial transaction, for the ranch was well known for growing a beautiful garden. Pumpkins, squash, corn, several fruits and vegetables were even sold at local markets. Sim had created a piece of property to envy in the Beaverhead County, living and working out there for almost 40 years. He knew that his age and health were a factor in running the ranch as satisfactory as he once did. It was time to move on. Later, the ranch was bought by the Rebushes, and the Bullocks ran it thereafter. A descendant of the Bullocks still lives at the stage station location today. May 16, 1909, Sim Estes passed away at his granddaughter Lulu Creasy's home on North Pacific Street. He was ill for a short time and peacefully passed away in the morning hours. He was a highly respected figure in this county, and his name is chronicled in all of the Montana history books. He was a man whom everyone liked. He was always there to help his friends and family. People who knew him stated that he was cool-headed, a deliberate man with splendid judgment. The pallbearers at his funeral were Martin Barrett, Craig Cornell, A.F. Grader, Terrence Flynn, and William Rowe. He must have been very well liked and pretty wealthy to have such prestige friends like them. Mr. Estes is buried at Mountain View Cemetery next to his second wife, Hattie. Where did Sim's money go? With his wife and family members all gone or moved away, I'd imagine his stepdaughter and granddaughters got some of it. At the time of Sim's death, Etta Thompson was listed in the city directory at 130 Montana above the China Garden. Lulu was living with her husband Oscar and her son Simeon on North Pacific Street. But by 1910 census, Etta is still listed at 130 North Montana as head, no mention of Joseph, her husband. Listed under her is Lulu and Simeon, boarders. Also listed is a Sam McCarthy musician, a Minnie McCarthy servant, both black, and working in the house of prostitution. If you thought I wasn't going to talk about early day Dillon brothels tonight, you were wrong. I knew it. I have seen Etta Thompson's name over the last 5 years of trying to figure out the red light districts of this town. It took this project to find the proof and the connection. Lulu and Oscar do end up in a divorce in 1910, Oscar claiming she had committed adultery. In 1910, Etta Thompson purchased the Anna Hart's lodging house. Anna Hart had been running a lodging house and millinery shop above the O.E. Morris building since 1895. Later that year, Etta opened another lodging house at 132 North Montana Street, now the apartments above Cranny's Cafe. This lodging house later became the Rex Rooms in the 1950s, also closing in 63 like the Mint Montana Hotel. At some point between 1905 and 1914, Etta and Joseph Thompson were divorced. Joseph married his second wife in 1914. He passed away in 1917, owning land up in Access Canyon. Etta married her third husband, Erwin Sheck, in Salt Lake City, Utah in 1914. She disposed of all of her properties in Dillon, owning several lodging houses, and moved to New York with her husband to get into real estate. It must not have lasted long, because in 1917, she was back in Dillon buying yet another rooming house. This one being the Crystal Rooming House. At this time, I believe it was at 128 North Montana Street, where the tattoo parlor sits today. But that same year, there was an ordinance in town for the red light district to be shut down. So the evil temptations of our town would be gone. Although they knew that the city taxes would have to go up if they shut them down. The rooming houses, lodging houses, and hotels were paying a lot in taxes and would have to be made up somewhere. After the ill-famed houses and bars closed during Prohibition, Etta and Lulu moved to Washington State, where her daughter Harriet was living. Etta, yet again, got married for the fourth time. The marriage certificate was dated 1926, Mr. Daniel Boone, fourth marriage, divorce, 61, to a Mary E. Shuck. Second marriage, widowed, Mother Harriet Estes, Father Sim Estes, maiden name Estes. She lied a lot on that one. Must not have lasted very long, for she passed away a Mrs. Etta Shuck in Washington, a year before her daughter Lulu passed away in that same state. Etta Shuck is buried in Mountain View Cemetery without a headstone. Etta Thompson, I believe, used some of her inheritance money to help build the second wave of the red light district here in Dillon. If you were at my bars and brothels program, or not mine, at the museum's bars and brothels program back in November, you may remember this name and her story. When Sim owned the holding cell and saloon in the 1880s, it sat on the corner of what is now Court Street and Pacific Street. Dillon's original courthouse sat across the street where the Episcopalian Guildhall sits today. Somewhere in the late 1880s, early 1890s, Minnie Smith, a notorious woman from this town, bought the log building and moved it to the island. The building was no longer needed as a new courthouse and jail cell were being built. Located just north of Virginia Street was Dillon's original red light district. It is where Ace Hardware Block sits today. The island had several homes and body houses. The most well-known was the Big Brick. Madame Arabella Phillips owned the large edifice until her death when Minnie Smith purchased it. Along with Arabella and Minnie, there were other madames in the island district. Cora McBride, Lenny Phillips, Mattie Bristow. They were all constantly in the paper for getting fines for themselves and their working girls. Minnie Smith's name being printed most in the paper for fines. Lenny Phillips once spoke up in the courtroom about other notorious places like the Badlands, not the island, never getting fined. That made me believe that there was another red light district. Perhaps it was the new lodging houses and furnished rooms in the downtown district of Dillon. They were smart and started to disguise their services by running a side business under their millinery shop, lodging house, or furnished room. The island district was on the north end of town, close to the China Gardens and the original Cabbage Patch. There were many fires, robberies, shootings, suicides at the island. The crime was probably higher due to the poverty in the area. There was disease. The paper stating a quarantine raised on the island for smallpox. A hoped thing in the past was not so, as 2 men were quarantined to their cabin in Hogan's Alley. And Susie Ray, a worker from the red light district, was in Salt Lake for treatment for the dreaded disease. Maybe the Badlands was the new district south of the island that the girls of the island would talk about not getting any fines. Maybe a little more high-class establishments, maybe even a possible payoff. Anna Hart and Emma Carhart were proprietresses of some of the first lodging and millinery shops. They were in the new brick buildings in downtown Dillon, along with Vivian Moore, just a couple blocks away. I believe that these were the madames that didn't get fined for their ill-famed houses. In 1901, Minnie built a brick building on Montana Street, costing her $8,000. This building was just 2 doors down from Vivian Moore's lodging house. When the building was completed, it had Dillon's first street-level entry to the second-floor business. A doctor used the second floor upon opening as his clinic, and the street level was a saloon. In 1904, Minnie had been living in the south part of town for a short time before the people there signed a petition to have her removed and put back in the part of town that she belonged. At this point, she was in a relationship with the chief of police. Upon removal of Minnie Smith from the Morton house, Chief of Police Stone was relieved of his duty as chief, and the new chief was hired the next day. By 1910, Minnie had become an invalid, residing in a house just south of the Big Brick. She had been robbed and beaten. She even having enough money to live on the nice part of town, but because of her way of life, she was forced to stay on her side. Minnie Smith, Dillon's most successful early day madam, passed away owning an abundance of property in Dillon. Parts of the downtown district, Rife subdivision, and several blocks north of Virginia Street. She was worth over $1 million in today's funds. She supplied the justice system here with thousands of dollars in fines over the years of her red light reign. There was an auction after her death selling her belongings and her properties. Several townspeople were there to purchase her treasures for cheap. Diamond rings, earrings, and brooches going for over $100 apiece. J.W. Wickedall bought a diamond sunburst for $180. Bookcases and dining tables going for $7 to $18 apiece. Several items were bought by Beaverhead Title Company, including 2 bureaus, a desk, and an old piano. Most items costing $3, the piano $20. At this point, Minnie's family was not happy with all the sales and filed a claim that they should be receiving the money, being next of kin. It took over 13 years to get her estate settled. Her sister, Ida Valentine, sent money to have her remains buried here in Dillon. Her death was due to paralysis. In those days, untreated syphilis turned into paralysis. Minnie Smith was a pioneer to Dillon's red light district. She paved the way for people like Etta Thompson to continue to grow the oldest profession known to man. When I first read about Minnie, I was researching a lynching that happened here in 1883. The hanging took place inside the holding cell in Sim's building. That is the building that Minnie moved for her bordello. I've been trying to find the connection between Minnie and Sim. Whatever happened to Oscar Creasy? After he divorced Lulu, he got custody of their son Simeon. Oscar purchased land near what is now the Ripley School. It was known as part of the Spur Ranch in the 1900s. Oscar started having strokes, causing him to be partially paralyzed. He couldn't take care of Sim anymore, so he went to live with a Mrs. Ripley. In 1916, Oscar Creasy died of paralysis due to cerebral syphilis. His son Sim stayed in Beaverhead County as a ranch hand. When Minnie died in 1913, she was not very well liked in Dillon. She was labeled notorious. Although her grave sits amongst the most wealthy and well-noted citizens in Dillon, even if she was prohibited to live in the nicest part of town, she made sure to buy plots right next to him. And she is laid to rest there between them as her birth name, Clara Valentine. Clara Valentine was born in Iowa in 1863. She was the youngest of 6 siblings. Her oldest sister's name was Sarah. Sarah married her husband, Jacob Creasy, making Oscar Minnie's nephew. I am not sure the exact time Minnie Smith moved to Dillon. The first time her name was in the Dillon Tribune was in June of 1886 when she and Lottie Morton were fined in the court for running a house of soiled reputation. The next time was on a dead letter list in 1887. It has the name Clara Valentine. Someone in her family knew where she was. It's still a mystery to me where Minnie Smith was before she came to Dillon. The connection through Sim is by marriage, but they are still connected. Could buying the jail cell be the first interaction they had? I just want to thank everybody for coming to the Depot Theater tonight. If you are interested in hearing more about the lynching at Sim Estes' building in 1883 and other Beaverhead County ghost stories, they will be featured in our October show, Ghost Stories of Beaverhead County. Thank you so much.